A Great Argead Saga Alexein, Alexander the Great. Volume 1, Telesias, The War Dance. By Naki. A new episode every single day. Episode 31, Athens, Phoenix's Gaze. Battle of the Haliacmen, Day 2, The Midnight Verdict. The corridor echoed with the frantic rustle of silk and the rhythmic clatter of medical tools. Queen Eurydice moved with a desperate driven pace, her royal robes hitched high to keep them from the grime of the palace halls. Behind her, the court physician, Hieron, struggled to keep up, his heavy medicinal bag swaying, his young assistant sweating as he clutched a stack of fresh linen tunics to his chest. "Open the door," Eurydice commanded, her voice vibrating with a mother's terror. She hammered against the stone, her regal composure fracturing with every second of silence. Inside, the heavy bolt slid back with a hollow thud. The door swung open, and Eurydice stood in the threshold, her face pale. "Mother is here," she whispered, stepping aside. Eurydice burst into the sanctum, the light of the torches catching the sheen of sweat on her brow. She stopped dead. Her gaze fell upon Philip and Archelaus, who stood caked in the foul, oil-black silt of the marshes, their skin sallow, their clothes hanging in rotting, muddy tatters. She gasped, a sound of pure, visceral horror. "We heard you were in a death fever," Eurydice began, her voice trembling as she gestured toward them. "And I find you two dripping like drowned rats reeking of the abyss. What in the name of the gods is happening here?" Eurydice stepped forward, reaching out to steady her mother. "Mother, we lied. We had to. We were desperate to speak to you, to show you that the walls are no longer our only hope." Philip stepped forward, his eyes locked onto his mother's. The grime on his face couldn't mask the terrifying, cold intelligence burning in his gaze. "Mother, listen. We cannot remain in this tomb until the Athenians win or lose. If they fail, nobody is coming for us. We will die in the dark, forgotten, while the usurper feasts on our bones." Eurydice looked at her son, and despite the filth, she saw not a boy, but a king in the making. She looked at the boys, then at Hieron. "Give them the linens," she ordered softly. "Change, both of you. You look like the grave itself." As they began to strip away the foul-smelling mud, Eurydice continued, her voice low. "If Pausanias wins, we are all dead, one by one, and you, my sons, will be the last." But the situation changed only an hour ago. Philip froze, a clean tunic mid-air. Changed? How? The Athenian fleet hasn't even broken the horizon. What could have shifted? Iphicrates has not arrived, Eurydice admitted, her eyes distant, but our generals, led by Parmenion and Ismenias, have moved. They have successfully secured our port and several of the outer gates. The final gate will be ours before the bells strike midnight. Eurydice's eyes widened, hope blossoming in her chest. "So we are free? We can leave the sanctum? Pella is ours again." "Not yet," Eurydice countered, her voice hardening. "We cannot rest until Iphicrates and his fleet actually land and grind Pausanias into the dust. Until then, you are all still targets. You remain here." Philip's mind was a whirlwind of tactical calculations. He imagined the dash from the sanctum, the race to the gates, but he knew the reality. He would be caught by the usurper's remaining patrols before he even crossed the palace courtyard. He looked down at the clean white linen, feeling the sudden sharp weight of his helplessness. "So the port is held," Philip murmured, his voice calculating. "And the last gate is falling." "What of the usurper?" "He is playing a fool's game," Eurydice explained. "Pausanias has moved the majority of his army to the coast to prevent the landing, even burning his own siege engines to buy time with fire. He left only a skeleton crew to hold the city. Our generals saw the weakness and struck like vipers." "The plan then," Philip said, his eyes narrowing as he envisioned the battlefield, "is to bleed Pausanias' army dry, just as the Athenians arrive?" "It is a dangerous bet," Eurydice conceded, her expression somber. "It may cost us many men before the Athenians can join the fray. It is a gamble on blood." Eurydice shivered, looking at her brothers. "It's a massacre if the fleet is delayed." Eurydice turned toward the door, her silhouette framed by the dim light of the corridor. "The gods hold the outcome now. There is nothing more for us to do tonight but wait. Change your clothes, sleep if you can. By sunrise, we will know if we are a kingdom or a graveyard." The eastern gate, the very epicenter of the supposed breakathad, fallen into a strange, expectant silence. Pausanias's men, huddled behind their makeshift barricades of overturned carts and jagged barrels, were brittle with tension. Their spears were leveled at the city streets, fingers white-knuckled against the shafts. They had braced for a second wave of rioting rebels. They had expected the high-pitched screams, the flickering fire, and the frantic, disorganized chaos of a mob. Instead, the night offered them something far more terrifying: the methodical, rhythmic crunch of Irulan's shod boots marching in perfect unison. From the fog-choked alleyways, the Macedonian vanguard emerged. It was not the disorganized rabble the guards had anticipated, not a ragged mob of desperate men, but a phalanx, disciplined and deadly. Parmenion moved at the center, his presence like a slow, unstoppable tide. Beside him, Ismenias walked with the predatory grace of a wolf, his eyes scanning the gloom for any sign of hesitation in the enemy's line. Young Attalus brought up the flank, his spear tipped with the cold finality of a predator. Their armor gleamed with the dark, wet sheen of the night air, reflecting the flickering torchlight in streaks of silver and shadow. Every footfall was calculated, every breath held in a lethal, synchronized rhythm. Behind them, the civilian warriors trailed, a desperate tapestry of the city's survivors. Their faces were grim, masked in the suit of the long night, their makeshift weapons, sharpened scythes, heavy iron rods, and stolen daggers held with a newfound, terrifying resolve. They were no longer victims cowering in the dark. They were the teeth of a trap snapping shut. Look at them, Parmenion thought, feeling the familiar, grounding weight of the shield against his arm. They are not fighting for a throne tonight. They are fighting for the right to wake up in a house that isn't burning. He caught Ismenias's eye, a silent communication passing between them, a recognition that the theater of war had shifted. Steady, Ismenias whispered, his voice barely a breath, meant only for the line behind him. Do not let the rage burn you out. We are the steel, not the fire. Young Attalus gripped his spear tighter, his heart hammering against his ribs, not from fear, but from the savage exhilaration of the hunt. He watched the Pausanias guards recoil, their formations buckling as the reality of the phalanx hit them. They thought us broken, Attalus mused, a cold, sharp smile playing on his lips. They thought we were the prey. As the vanguard pressed forward, the very air seemed to thicken with the expectation of violence. The civilians, sensing the tide turning, began to murmur a low, guttural chant, a sound that wasn't quite a prayer and wasn't quite a scream. It was the sound of a city reclaiming its soul. They didn't just march, they advanced with the weight of every grievance, every hunger, and every loss channeled into the tip of a blade. Parmenion stopped 10 paces from the barricade, his gaze heavy and absolute. He let the silence hang, a suffocating, heavy shroud that made the guards' breaths hitch in their throats. He wasn't just commanding an army, he was witnessing a transformation. The broken, starved people of Pella had vanished, replaced by something far more dangerous. They were no longer a city under siege. They were the retribution they had been promised. The Pausanias guards stood their ground for a single, frozen heartbeat, eyes darting to the flanking shadows. Everywhere they looked, the streets were choked with Macedonian steel. They were no longer policing a riot. They were staring into the cold, unblinking eyes of an army. They've sealed the gates, a sergeant whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood. He glanced back toward the harbor, seeking the comfort of reinforcements, but he found only the dark, empty maw of the street leading to the silent docks. The port, the harbor watch is gone. Parmenion stepped forward, his blade held low, his gaze heavy and absolute. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He simply gestured, and 100 Macedonian archers rose from the surrounding rooftops, their bows drawn, arrows nocked, the tips shimmering like venomous eyes aimed at the hearts of the usurper's men. The sergeant's nerve finally shattered. The hollow promises of gold, the threats of execution, and the cold, distant directives of Pausanias all evaporated in the face of the encroaching steel. Drop them? The sergeant roared, discarding his own spear as if it were a burning coal. Run! Another guard shrieked. The formation disintegrated. Pausanias's men didn't just retreat. They broke, abandoning the barricades they had bled to build. They scrambled over the debris, feet slipping on wet cobblestones, their armor clattering like falling pots. They didn't head for the city, nor for their homes. They ran for the only thing left, the coast, where their master still waited on the dunes. They were deserters in their own city, fleeing the ghosts they had created. Then, the eastern gate began its final act. The heavy iron chains groaned, a sound of tortured metal that shivered through the quiet street. With a final, agonizing shriek of rusted hinges, the massive wooden panels swung wide, pushed by a dozen straining backs. The gate did not just open, it exhaled. From the darkness of the city, a surge of humanity poured out into the night. It was the Theban heavy infantry, their bronze cuirasses dulled by the shadows, marching with the rhythmic, heavy-footed stomp of an earthquake. Behind them, the civilian warriors followed, the men who had been the bait of the previous night, their faces illuminated by the wild, guttering light of torches. Their eyes were not those of men who had just won a skirmish. They were the eyes of men who had been pushed to the edge of the abyss and had decided to jump, dragging their enemies down with them. For the memory of the dead? A Theban captain roared, his voice a guttural, jagged command. The rage was a physical weight in the air. These were the men who had been locked in the city, starved, and kept under the usurper's heel. As they stepped out onto the open road, they saw the backs of the fleeing Pausanias guards, the very men who had held them hostage, scrambling toward the coast like panicked vermin. A collective, soul-shaking howl erupted from the Theban lines. It was a sound stripped of discipline, filled instead with the pure, distilled acid of vengeance. They did not move in a calculated phalanx. They broke into a sprint, a tide of iron and fury flowing out of the gate. The civilians, wielding rusted axes, makeshift clubs, and stolen daggers, did not lag behind. They surged forward, their faces twisted into masks of feral hatred. They were no longer the terrified people of Pella. They were an execution squad. They won't just kill them, Parmenion thought, watching the surge from the shadows of the gatehouse, his hand tied on his sword hilt. They will dismantle them. The ground shook under the running feet of the Thebans. The guardsmen on the road ahead turned, their eyes widening in horror as they realized the ghosts they were running from had materialized into a wall of vengeful steel. "They're coming," the guardsman shrieked, stumbling over his own gear. "The city! The city is pouring out." The Theban captain didn't even slow down to raise his spear. He slammed into the rearmost fleeing soldier, the impact of his shield sending the man flying into the dirt, where a dozen civilian blades found him in an instant. The gate was no longer a threshold, it was a wound, and the city was bleeding pure, righteous hate onto the fields of Pella. As the Theban army swept past the gatehouse, Ismenias stood on the threshold, his chest heaving, his face splattered with the grit of the fight. He watched the wave of steel wash over the road, his eyes burning with the realization that the trap had been sprung, and the wolf was about to be torn to pieces. Ismenias watched the last of the deserters vanish into the gloom toward the beach, a dark, satisfied smile crossing his lips. He signaled his men to stand down. "Let them run," old Attalus rumbled, stepping up beside him. "Let them carry the fear to Pausanias. Let them tell him exactly what is waiting for him in the shadows." Parmenion watched the horizon, where the faint, rhythmic glow of distant campfires signaled Pausanias' last stand. He turned to his men, his voice cold as the coming dawn. "They go to their master," Parmenion said. "And when they reach him, they will bring the news that his kingdom has already stopped breathing. Form up. We march to the sea. The wolf is cornered." The news arrived not as a whisper, but as a scream from a dying messenger. Pausanias stood on the dunes overlooking the Haliacmon, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the Athenian fleet remained a ghost story of potential destruction. He was still watching the waves when a mud-spattered scout collapsed at his feet, gasping out the litany of disaster. The eastern gate was shattered, the riots were a wildfire, and the harbor, the beating heart of his supply line, had gone silent. The blood drained from Pausanias' face, leaving it the color of parchment. He scanned the horizon behind him, toward the city. The smoke he saw rising from the port was not the smoke of a defensive fire. It was the signal of an execution. The rebellion, he realized, his grip on his spear tightening until his knuckles turned bloodless. The screams at the gate. It was never a breakout. It was a lure. He had been tricked into stripping his own walls, into abandoning his foundation to guard a stretch of empty sand. He turned to his officers, his voice a low, tremulous snarl. They didn't just take the gate. They took the port. They have the city. "We can march back, my lord," one of his lieutenants shouted, his hand hovering over his sword. We can retake the gates before the Athenians arrive. No, Pausanias spat, his eyes darting back to the sea. Look at the time. Look at the distance. If we turn back now, we are caught in a forced march, exhausted, with our backs to the very army we've been waiting to crush. They want us to run. They want us to break our own lines. He looked toward the dark looming shape of Pella, then back to the surf. He did a rapid, brutal calculation in his head. Without the Athenians, he could still crush the rebels. His core force was disciplined, veteran, and loyal. But if Iphicrates landed while he was tangled in the city streets, he would be ground between the city walls and the Athenian pike. The ground seemed to tilt beneath him. He had been a predator waiting for a strike, and now he felt the cold steel of a knife pressing against his own spine. The Macedonians are not just sitting behind walls, Pausanias muttered, his gaze shifting to the dark reedy banks of the Lydia's channel. They are moving. They will not stay in Pella. They will come for the coast. They will try to pin us here, to ensure the Athenians have a clear path to the sand. He turned to his chief scout, a man whose face was hard and impassive. Forget the city. If they have it, they have it. Our life is the landing. He pointed a shaking finger toward the dark, swaying marshes that bordered the beach. Watch both the coast and the channel. Watch how the Macedonians move. If they try to flank us from the reeds, if they try to turn this beach into a killing ground, I want to know before they draw breath. We hold the surf. If we stop the fleet, we survive. If the fleet lands, then we fight for every grain of sand. Pausanias took a deep, shuddering breath, the salt air burning in his lungs. He was trapped between a city that had betrayed him and a sea that threatened to drown him. Let them come, he thought, his fear curdling into a desperate, feral resolve. If I am to lose the throne, I will make sure the beach is paved with the bones of those who took it. The Aegean was a flat, ink-black mirror, disturbed only by the rhythmic churn of 100 bronze-tipped oars. Iphicrates stood at the prow of his flagship, his eyes fixed on the distant, jagged silhouette of the Macedonian coastline. The air was cool, carrying the faint, metallic tang of the coming dawn. He had been watching the horizon for hours, searching for the prearranged spark of revolution. Then he saw it. A thin, gray ribbon of smoke rose from the direction of Pella's port. It was not the rolling, chaotic billow of a city undergoing a sack. It was too contained, too deliberate. That is no accidental fire, Iphicrates thought, his fingers drumming a steady, impatient rhythm against the railing. That is the smoke of a signal. His pilot stepped up beside him, peering into the gloom. A fire at the port, General. Should we signal the reserve? Wait, Iphicrates commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. If that is our people, they are telling us something. But is it a warning or an invitation? He turned his gaze toward the nearby crags, where the Macedonian signal towers stood silhouetted against the waning moon. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A torch flared bright, then was plunged into a vessel of water, then raised again. The hydraulic telegraph. In the distance, on the opposing tower, he saw the mirror flicker of a response. The message was clear. The harbor is open. Iphicrates exhaled, a sound of profound relief that he kept carefully masked from his officers. The gamble had paid off. The city was not a tomb, but a threshold. The port is secured, Iphicrates announced, his tone clipped and professional. Pass the order to the fleet commanders. We proceed with the primary maneuver. He gestured to the vast, shadowed expanse of the fleet behind him. Split the formation. 2/3 of the vessels, the heavy transports, and the assault craft are to make for the coast. Stay low, maintain a wide berth, and do not commit to the surf. I want you to act as a distraction, draw Pausanias' eyes to the shoreline, and scout the dunes for his main force. Wait for the first gray light of dawn. We do not land until the sun reveals the topography of the beach. And the remaining third? His lieutenant asked. The remainder will shadow the coastline, then veer sharply toward the port, Iphicrates said, his eyes scanning the dark water. They are to move in absolute silence. No torches, no shouting. They are to slip into the harbor under the cover of the night's final hour. If the port is truly ours, they will hold the docks and wait for the signal to strike. He watched the fleet begin to maneuver, the ships moving like synchronized predators in the dark. Pausanias thinks he is waiting for a conventional invasion, Iphicrates mused, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He doesn't realize he is already surrounded by his own city. "General," the pilot noted, "the coast will be a killing ground if we land prematurely." "Which is why we wait," Iphicrates replied, his gaze locked on the horizon where the first faint suggestion of lavender touched the sky. "We allow Pausanias to watch the coast, to sweat unpace on the sand, while he thinks he holds the advantage. We let him commit his forces to the surf. Then, when he is fully distracted, the port detachment will emerge to take the city's throat. Once we hold the harbor, the landing at the coast becomes a slaughterhouse for his men, not ours." He looked back toward Pella. The city was still quiet, but he could almost feel the vibration of the coming storm. "Keep the scouts alert," he ordered, turning away from the prow. "When the sun crests that ridge, I want the fleet in position. Today, we don't just win a battle. We dismantle a usurper's life's work." Athens, Phoenix's Gaze. July 28, 368 BCE, the Nix, Athens. To the casual observer, the city-state of Athens was a paradox of sublime intellect and volatile democracy. For generations, she had been the radiant intellectual laboratory of Hellas, the birthplace of tragedy, philosophy, and the radical notion that citizens, rather than kings, should dictate the laws of men. Athens, Phoenix's Gaze. July 28, 368 BCE, the Nix, Athens. To the casual observer, the city-state of Athens was a paradox of sublime intellect and volatile democracy. For generations, she had been the radiant intellectual laboratory of Hellas, the birthplace of tragedy, philosophy, and the radical notion that citizens, rather than kings, should dictate the laws of men. At the absolute core of this civilization was democratia, the raw, literal rule of the demos, the common people. Here, the governance of the state did not flow from ancestral lineage, dynastic bloodlines, or elite oligarchic cabals, but from the collective will of the ordinary citizenry. The driving mechanism of this radical experiment was the ecclesia, a massive sovereign assembly where every male citizen, whether a wealthy landowner or a penniless harbor rower, possessed an equal vote, isagoria, to directly draft legislation, declare wars, and vote on the exile of dangerous politicians. To prevent the emergence of career politicians and tyrants, the operational machinery of Athens relied heavily on the use of the lot. Thousands of public offices, including the 500-member governing council, pool, were filled by random selection rather than elections, guaranteeing that the governing class was merely a reflection of the people themselves. Yet, this revolutionary architectural blueprint of human liberty possessed a stark, uncompromising boundary. It was a world engineered to make the adult male completely supreme. In the sophisticated mechanics of Athenian democracy, women were denied their voice entirely, structurally cast out of the political matrix, and treated as legal minors throughout their entire lives. An Athenian woman possessed no citizenship rights, could not vote, and was forbidden from owning significant property or conducting economic transactions worth more than a single measure of barley. From birth to the grave, she existed entirely beneath the shadow of a male guardian, Kyrios, her father, her husband, or even her own adult son, who dictated her marriage, managed her dowry, and spoke for her in the courts. In the ideal Athenian home, a respectable woman was expected to remain invisible and silent, her existence confined to the inner domestic quarters, gymnasium, hidden away from the rational daylight of civic discourse. Indeed, the very concept of a sovereign monarch had long been engineered out of the Attic constitution. While the ancient heavy title of Basileus, king, still lingered within the city's legal lexicon, it had been thoroughly hollowed out of its autocratic muscle. In democratic Athens, the archon Basileus was not a monarch but a temporary civic ghost, a solitary magistrate chosen annually by the blind luck of a lottery machine. He possessed zero political sovereignty, wielded no armies, and commanded no treasuries. His jurisdiction was strictly confined to the preservation of ancestral state sacrifices and presiding over homicide trials at the stone court of the Areopagus. To the Athenian mind, a king was a domesticated civil servant, bound by the rule of law. A stark and civilized contrast to what they chose to categorize as the untamed autocrats of the East and the blood-soaked warlords of the North. The very name of the polis stood as a living monument to this triumph of intellect over raw force, derived from Athena, the goddess of strategic warfare, wisdom, and divine reason, marking the city not merely as a collection of streets and ports, but as the earthly fortress of mind. According to myth, the city's beginning was forged in a divine duel for its soul between Athena and Poseidon, lord of the seas. Standing upon the rocky Acropolis, Poseidon struck the earth with his trident, bringing forth a violent saltwater spring and promising absolute naval dominance. Athena, however, knelt and quietly planted a single olive tree into the dry soil, a symbol of peace, sustenance, and agricultural economy. The citizens chose the goddess's gift, grounding the city's inception in the triumph of deliberate wisdom over volatile power. This early commitment to establishing cosmic order and defending divine reason extended far beyond Attica's borders. Historically, it was the military intervention and political weight of Athens, acting as the ideological backbone of the Amphictyonic League, that defined the First Sacred War. When the coastal city of Kirrha began extorting and assaulting the unprotected pilgrims, journeying to consult the oracle of Apollo, Athens mobilized to protect the sacred spiritual network of Hellas. Under the strategic direction of the statesman Solon, the League launched a devastating 10-year siege against the rogue fortress. It was an unsparing, total war that crossed the threshold of myth, culminating in the poisoning of Kirrha's water supply with toxic hellebore roots. A ruthless stroke of chemical warfare orchestrated to cleanse the path to the god. By utterly obliterating Kirrha and dedicating its blighted fields forever to Apollo, Artemis, and Leto, Athens effectively liberated the sanctuary of Delphi from local tyrants, transforming a vulnerable mountain shrine into the autonomous, Panhellenic spiritual navel of the world. Yet, behind the white marble of her temples lay a history forged in the fires of maritime supremacy and catastrophic ruin. A century prior, Athens had saved Greece from the Persian Colossus. It was Athenian naval brilliance that had broken Xerxes' fleet at Salamis in 479 BCE. A victory that transformed the city from a regional power into a rapacious maritime empire. Throughout her 5th century Golden Age, the sleek three-banked war galleys known as triremes ruled the waves, converting the Aegean Sea into an Athenian lake and funding the construction of the Parthenon with a tribute of conquered islands. But imperial arrogance bred its own destruction. The Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BCE, a brutal 27-year civil war against Sparta and her allies, had ended in absolute catastrophe. Starved into submission, her great wooden walls torn down to the mocking sound of enemy flute players, and her empire utterly dismantled, Athens had been brought to her knees. To her enemies, the Attic phoenix was dead, its ashes scattered into the cold sea. Yet, a safe Greece was an illusion. When Sparta's subsequent tyranny grew intolerable, the surviving architects of Athenian democracy executed a patient, brilliant resurrection. In 378 BCE, they established the Second Athenian Confederacy, not as a heavy-handed empire, but as a sophisticated, voluntary naval alliance designed to check Spartan aggression while respecting the autonomy of its members. Slowly, meticulously, Athens rebuilt her fleet, replanted her timber networks, and reclaimed her financial solvency. By the year 368 BCE, the geopolitical landscape had fractured into a strange new reality. The historic titan, Sparta, had just been permanently crippled by the landlocked military powerhouse of Thebes at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE. With Sparta broken and Thebes overextending its land armies to claim absolute hegemony, Athens found herself poised at a razor-thin historical intersection. She was no longer the broken victim of 404 BCE, but a hungry, resurgent naval predator, waiting for the land powers of Greece to bleed each other dry so she could reclaim her ancestral birthright. The total dominion of the waves. The late July heat sat heavy over Athens, a shimmering haze that made the marble of the Acropolis almost too bright to look upon. Down at the Piraeus, the smell of the sea was a thick, briny perfume, the scent of memory and destiny. They remembered Marathon, the stinging victory of Salamis, and the golden age when their triremes turned the Aegean into an Athenian lake. The Parthenon still shone, but to the men gathered in the Agora, its beauty was a haunting reminder of how far the phoenix had fallen before beginning its slow, painstaking ascent. By this midsummer, the city had rebuilt her navy and her pride, weaving the Second Athenian Confederacy into a nimble vessel for renewed ambition. In the bustling Agora, the beating heart of all political and spiritual life, citizens debated the nature of the soul while simultaneously dissecting the latest failures of their rivals. Crucial to this renewed pride was the deliberate construction of the Athenian Gaze, a psychological shield and an ideological lens, through which the assembly systematically undervaluated all neighboring nations. To make their own supremacy feel like an absolute law of nature, Athens looked outward through a highly tinted perspective, transforming foreign realities into comforting caricatures. Through this specific Athenian lens, what they called the primitive North was dismissed as a swamp of filth and madness. In the eyes of the polished citizens gathered in the shade of the colonnades, what the Athenian sees as the barbarian North was not a collection of developing states, but an illiterate wasteland, populated by goat herds and drunken brawlers who spoke a mangled, barely recognizable dialect. "Have you parsed the dispatches from Igi?" an elder counselor remarked near the steps of the metrum, fanning himself against the stifling midsummer air. It is a theater of pure, barbaric turmoil. They hold a festival to honor a dead sovereign, and before the ritual fires can even consume the offerings, they turn the very stage into a butcher's block. Did the regent really assassinate the king? A younger merchant asked, his brow furrowing in genuine surprise as he paused by the shade of the column. Of course. Who else? The elder scoffed, waving his hand with a sharp chuckle of absolute dismissal. Because they all are barbarian. They are utterly unable to think like us Athenians. The regent Ptolemy and his kin performed a weaponed war dance for King Alexander II. They danced him in geometric lines, closer and closer, until the choreography simply dissolved into regicide. To think they call themselves Hellenes, yet they pass a crown not through the elegant mathematics of our lottery, but by the crude plunging of daggers between cousins. It is the inescapable cycle of the shallow grave. This systemic undervaluation of northern governance was structurally compounded by their deep, unyielding misogyny. Because Athens placed women so entirely beneath the male, viewing them as inherently emotional, weak, and dangerous if left unchecked, the political prominence of northern royal women was seen as the ultimate symptom of barbarian decay. They stamped particularly hard upon the terrifying reputation of the women of the region, foreshadowing the treatment that would one day befall the Molossian princess Polysena, the future mother of Alexander the Great. At this point, the young girl was a mere 7 years old, entirely ignorant of the political arena, and with no eyes on the 14-year-old Philip yet. She was completely unknown to most nations, including the arrogant elite of Athens. Yet she would soon burst into the Greek political arena, renowned for her razor-sharp, keen political foresight. She would eventually marry Philip and take the name Olympias, at which point the Athenian Gaze would brutally slam her into their manufactured template of female hatred, cementing her image as an emotionally unstable, cunning, and crazy, jealous evil, who worships snakes and danced like a maniac in the wild rites of Dionysus. "I hear the Molossian house is already breeding a new generation of monsters up there," the elder counselor whispered, his voice dripping with an intense, curdled disgust as he applied the sweeping Athenian lens to the northern bloodlines. "A race born of chaotic, feminine malice. They say a mere girl of 7 summers, a child who should be spinning wool, already captures wild serpents from the hills to toy within her chambers like simple dolls. A snake-worshipping fanatic in the cradle. And mark my words, she will soon throw herself into those ecstatic wild rites of Dionysus that are currently spreading like a wildfire through the veins of every city-state in Hellas. Imagine a state where such unstable, reptilian minds are permitted to grow and one day whisper into the ears of kings. It proves my point entirely. When a nation places no boundaries on its women, the mind rots and the state collapses into madness." The next snake-haired Gorgon. The younger philosopher laughed raucously, leaning against the warm stone of the colonnade. "A literal demigod witch in the making." "Ah, hold your tongue," a nearby playwright chimed in, his eyes lighting up with sudden artistic inspiration. "That could be a magnificent idea for our Athenian comedy theater." The audience at the City Dionysia would eat it up. "By the gods, yes," the merchant agreed, chuckling into his wine cup. "Those Athenian historic fiction writers will absolutely love it. Give them a wild, savage queen with a crown of vipers, and they will spin tales to terrify our citizens for a century." In reality, 7-year-old Polysena knew nothing of the grand political arena, nor did she have any inkling of the 14-year-old Prince Philip. She was simply a strange, fearless child in the rugged hills of Epirus who found a peculiar comfort in playing with the cold, slithering reptiles of her homeland. The deeper, blood-drenched Menadism of the Dionysian cult would claim her soul much later in her youth. Yet, because the ecstatic wave of Dionysus was indeed rapidly expanding and unsettling traditional structures all across Greece, the paranoid Athenian Gaze weaponized her innocent childhood fixation, preemptively transforming a little girl with a pet snake into a calculating, dangerous witch. The recent assassination of King Alexander II only served to confirm the manufactured Athenian prejudice. They undervaluated the complex tribal alliances and strategic depth of the region, choosing instead to see a people biologically incapable of true constitutional civilization. By structurally diminishing the North into a backward stereotype, Athens could easily ignore its rising danger. Further down the painted stoa, Strategos Callias stood with a fresh dispatch from the Peloponnese crumpled in his fist. He listened to the murmurs of the crowd, his voice cutting through with a polished academic disdain. "The Thebans," he muttered to his fellow counselors, "grow fat and proud on the memory of Leuctra. They believe themselves the new masters of Hellas, forgetting who truly owns the waves and who taught the world to think, while they were still wallowing in the Boeotian mud." Yet, the resentment of Theban hegemony ran even deeper in Athenian veins than their engineered contempt for the North. It was galling that a landlocked Boeotian power was now the arbiter of Greece. Athenian diplomacy had become a subtle, persistent poison. They worked quietly to sow discord among Thebes' allies, whispering promises of liberty to Peloponnesian cities tired of Theban heavy-handedness. For Callias, looking at the geopolitical board through his narrow city-centric lenses, the news that the Theban general Pelopidas was now entangling his elite troops in that northern chaos, wasting his brilliance on the restless Thessalians and trying to untangle the mess of what they called the primitive North, was nothing less than a divine comedy. "It is an absolute divine comedy," Callias declared openly to the gathered citizens, letting out a sharp, amused breath. Consider the cosmic irony. Pelopidas, the great champion of the South, marches his unyielding phalanx into that very cauldron of barbaric turmoil. Let the proud Boeotians play nursemaid to a fractured court of Macedonian half-breeds and snake-worshipping witches. Let them exhaust their treasuries and waste their blood trying to civilize a mountain swamp that is genetically destined to remain savage. A cold, calculating smile touched his lips as he glanced over the horizon, viewing the northern kingdom not as a budding power, but as the chaotic trap his prejudice demanded it be. Every Theban soldier stationed in what the Athenian sees as the barbarian North is one less shield Epaminondas can deploy against our interests in the Peloponnese. Let them drown in the Macedonian marshes. Athens will use the distraction to reclaim the soul of the Aegean. He looked toward the harbor, where the blazing summer sun caught the masts of 100 ships. The phoenix was no longer just rising, it was beginning to hunt. To be continued. A great Argead Saga Alexein. Volume 1, Telesias, the War Dance. A new episode every single day. We are dropping a new episode every day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 5 to 15-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesias playlist. Subscribe to follow the rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.